Hi, I'm Natasha Armitage-Evans, Head of Teaching, Learning and Assessment across Luminae FE colleges. I'm going to be talking to you today about developing a culture of reflective practice. And just to add that I'm really excited to be here, streaming into your living rooms, your offices, or if you're lucky enough, into your gardens with a nice cold beer. So we're going to be looking at reflective practice from three different angles really. So the why, the what and the how. So why do we do it? What do we use? And how do we implement it? So the why. So reflective practice, as we know, is really beneficial in producing high quality TLA and getting the best out of our teachers. But it can be difficult to make it purposeful and responsive. So the key to that is figuring out how to best reflect what works best for us as individuals, what do we do with those findings, and how responsive are we with those and in changing our practice from what we find. So the John Dewey quote speaks about us not learning from experience, but we learn from reflecting on experience. And when I think about this, I think about two key examples, one personal, one from home, and one from my own practice in the classroom. So my personal one is about my daughter learning to ride her bike. So when we're riding a bike, often we learn from falling off because we don't want to fall and land on the floor, obviously. So with my daughter, once the stabilisers were removed, she started to really think about what happened if she leant too much to the right or slowed down too much. So in that sense, she started to reflect on what she was doing and made adjustments in order to not fall off her bike. So with that in mind, she adjusted her balance so she didn't lean to the right, and she adjusted her speed so she was speeding up and not falling off her bike. My own practice in the classroom, I think about teaching some of the more difficult concepts. So back in the day when I was a PE teacher and not head of teaching, learning and assessment, I really thought about some of the more difficult concepts that my students struggle to grasp. So the cardiovascular system, for example, was a key one. So thinking about back when I taught this as a trainee for the very first time, which seems like an awfully long time ago, really thinking about why they didn't get it. Okay, difficult concept, they didn't understand it. And of course, they didn't get it because I'd not explained it very well. So through reflective practice and really thinking about what I delivered as part of that session, we created a version of that on the sports hall floor, of the cardiovascular system on the sports hall floor, with the students acting as the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. It was like a light bulb moment. They suddenly understood the cardiovascular system because we'd done it in a completely different way. It hadn't worked in the classroom, so we'd adapted it to make it more practical for them. They understood it, they got it. That wouldn't have happened if I'd not have reflected upon that experience. So the benefits then, if we look at this slide, I've just highlighted 6 main benefits. Obviously, there's lots and lots more. These are not exhaustive, but just really honing in and thinking about our teachers and our own professional growth as practitioners and leaders, and the benefits of using reflective practice to really grow as practitioners and develop. I think if we start using reflective practice, we really start thinking about innovation, creativity, and experimentation. We feel safer to do so. So really underpinning taking risks. Key one here, and Brookfield talks about this later on as part of this session, really thinking about how we understand our learners through reflective practice and how do we develop their reflective practice to make them more independent in their learning, but also understand the ways in which they learn and progress as individuals. As teachers, that big one around humility. So always believing that we can be better. And I think we do that quite well as teachers. We tend to have that down pat. We often underplay our own achievements. But understanding that through reflective practice, we can always do better. We often come out of sessions and we go, do you know what? It was all right, but I could have done this, 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 and this. Instead of just going, do you know what? That was a brilliant lesson. They understood it. They learnt it. The knowledge they've developed is amazing. And that's sometimes what we don't do very well as teachers. Always aiming for high quality teaching and learning. So really, really underpinning how we can do that. And what does high quality teaching and learning look like in our specific subjects of expertise and for our learners. And then lastly, I thought it was important to put this on because I think if we can become really good reflective practitioners, then quite often we can pass that on to our trainee teachers as mentors or as role models because they're new to the profession. They need to be able to be reflective, but they also need people that can replicate and show that to them. So I think that's quite a good link, really, linking up the trainee teachers with reflective practice and experience. And I find this really interesting, just key thoughts around the more experience we get, do we become more reflective? So I've just put on here a key question. So do we get better at reflecting as an experienced teacher? Or does it slip into the myriad of tasks and not having the time to do so effectively? I know that when I was on a full teaching timetable down in London, which is where I taught East London, it was very difficult to be able to reflect. And quite often I think that going back to my trainee time, that was my key reflection time. Maybe because I was on a reduced timetable, maybe because I had to do it as part of gaining QTS, but actually just that thought process on, do we become more reflective the more experience we get? So three key things I've put on there. So reflection in the session. So how do we do that? Quite often we're thinking on our feet. So for example, if a student or a selection student or all the class in some cases haven't understood the way in which we've delivered something, how do we reteach, reshape, remodel that as part of that session? Reflecting after the session. So I think this is a key one, really, having the time to do so as part of our PPA time, as part of the time that we're creating for ourselves, if it's at home, which sometimes it is with planning, which we all know around workload and well-being, but really thinking about how do we reflect after the session, and does that make us responsive in the planning for future lessons? And then lastly, reflection over time. So looking at our schemes of learning, our blocks of learning, our schemes of work, whatever you use, how do we reflect over time as experienced teachers? Now, just to highlight, some of the best reflective practitioners that I've come into contact with have been early career teachers. So models of reflective practice, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I thought it was just important just to mention it. Obviously, we all know, or we should all know, about models of reflective practice. It may be that you've not revisited those for quite some time. Quite often, the majority of us haven't looked at these since we were training. So our likely ones we've probably come across, our Gibbs, Kolb, but I particularly, from my own development and my own practice, like Brookfield. So 4 lenses, his reflective model, it looks at it from 4 different perspectives. Now, this is just a question-based reflective model that incorporates Brookfield's 4 lenses. So obviously it is adapted from Brookfield and from Dawson, but it just asks some of those key questions. So I think what we probably use particularly well is our own self or teacher reflection. That's probably the most well used out of the 4. How well we do that, could be discussed and debated, but I would say that's probably the most used one out of the 4. Our next point of call is probably our peers and colleagues, and getting them to have a look at how things are going, inviting them in, possibly, maybe doing some collaborative planning. But I think what we don't do so well is on the left-hand side. So our students, and inviting feedback from them to really shape and remodel what we're doing. And then lastly, scholarship. So taking into account research and evidence-based practice, how are we informing that into our own teaching, and thinking about how we can maybe conduct a learning research study or a teacher-led inquiry. So how do we develop the right culture? I think it's important to look at, I've got quite a lot of things on here, but I think the key one is time, and it comes up over and over again when we look at CPD, when we look at planning. Time is always the key thing that people bring up. So allowing our staff and ourselves the time to be able to develop our reflective practice. The next one I've put on here about developing self-awareness, I don't think that comes easy. And I think quite often we can be at two opposite ends of the spectrum. So we can think that we are doing great, and actually we're not doing so well as practitioners. So that Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby we overestimate how well we're doing. Or the opposite end of the scale, whereby we really play down actually how good we are and how well we are doing. So that self-awareness is critical, and we'll talk a little bit further down about how maybe we can develop that. The use of reflective practice through what we do day to day. So our teacher planner, if we still have those, I know some places don't use those anymore, but some do. Our schemes of learning. So some of the best reflective practice that I see on a day-to-day basis is where some of my teachers have used annotations on their scheme of learning. And then we start looking at some of those peer elements, so bringing some of those in. So peer observation and lesson study. How are we inviting the feedback of others to shape and inform our practice? Now I've put on here video observation. So some people might not be comfortable in allowing people into their sessions because of judgment, because of fear. So there's some great bits of software out there that can actually develop teaching practice through video observation, and that reflection that takes place after it's been recorded. So Iris, Swivel, Vio, others that are around and about, but really thinking about how we can use those to reflect and develop our practice. I've spoken about student feedback already, vital. So how are you going to gain that? How do you get that feedback from students, and how do you use the evidence? What we have started across Leeds City College this year are teacher-led inquiries as part of our coaching for teaching, learning and assessment, which is a pilot we're running in place of our current OTLA. So teacher-led inquiries, really thinking about and reflecting upon our current practice through self-assessment. What do we want to develop? What are we going to do about it? And what will the impact look like? Autonomy and ownership of professional development. I think if we look at the recent NFER report around that, and about staff really buying into their own professional development, seeing it as purposeful and useful in order to develop the practice, they've got to have autonomy over that and the ownership of that. So it's about thinking about how we instill that in our staff. Feeling safe to experiment. I spoke about this earlier with regards to innovation, really thinking about how we shape our quality systems. How do we conduct learning walks? How do we conduct observations? Do we conduct observations? Are they graded? Are they ungraded? Okay, all the different things that we can put into place and that we see across the country. It is still very different across different institutions. So really underpinning what we're using to make staff feel safe, and feeling that they can experiment without judgment or failure. So we've developed across Leeds, as I've already spoken about, a coaching culture, and we're starting to develop that across our pilot department. So we're using instructional coaching. So there's lots and lots of stuff around at the moment around coaching, particularly instructional coaching. So I'd really suggest starting to have a look at some of that. And then lastly, creating that open door policy, which I suppose links into staff feeling safe. You know, how are they being supported by managers, and who are they allowing into their classrooms? So I've just put up here, just to kind of finish off, before I summarise, just 5 reflective questions, really. So to start thinking about, I'm not going to go through these, but these are perhaps things that you'd like to revisit, and just key thoughts around what I envisaged would be the key things I'd be looking at as a practitioner, as part of developing my own practice, and my own reflections. So just to summarise, hopefully that's just it shed some light on my thoughts around reflective practice, and we've looked at the why, the what and the how. So just to finish off, so I think now more than ever is a time where we should be working with our staff to enable them to become more reflective, whilst also doing this as leaders ourselves. Doing this through a supportive and collaborative culture will build self-awareness. Trust and autonomy should then follow if we have the right culture in place, let me add. This will ensure that our staff can reap the rewards through the delivery of high quality TLA. But I think in order to get high quality TLA, it's crucial that we get reflective practice right. So I've just put up on this slide, as I've been talking and summarising, my email address and my Twitter handle. So any questions with regards to any of that, I'd be really excited to hear some of your ideas, concepts, or just to engage in some professional dialogue around some of these key areas. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I've probably gone way over my time, okay, but be enjoying your beers. Hopefully the weather's going to pick up. I'm saying this the day before, or a couple of days before this is going out, so hopefully the weather will pick up. And thank you very much for listening.